less
Okay.
you like people, the better.
All right, we're gonna start again.
All right.
guys.
I saw the turd first. I'm like, this is the
How's
turd
the,
shit. It was real smooth, like yogurt.
Can everyone
Did
see
this.
the screen okay, or should I turn some of the lights off?
I think if we have lights
I
off,
think
it
they
might be
were
good.
Let's see what that looks like. We can turn that off. And we can
Yeah, that's
turn
better.
it
I think it was like, I
on
don't know, use I
if you probably don't
crazy
really
idea.
need it. How's that? Better?
Yeah.
So, if you want to look at how Phragmites interacts with other organisms, here are some of the kinds of things you should keep in mind. You've all heard of wetlands, functions, and values. Functions are the ecological stuff that actually happens, so they're ecological processes. Values are human judgment. Values are what we now often call ecosystem services, which are based on ecological processes, but ultimately they're about what people get from nature and what we need from nature. So any habitat is good for some species and not others. The inside of this building is a habitat. You'd be surprised at how many organisms are sharing this space with us. All habitats are under stress from our cultural activities. Biodiversity, aspects of biodiversity do not necessarily depend on pristine or even relatively natural habitats. There are species that do very well in urban or disturbed areas, and there are others that don't. Utility, ecosystem services, whatever. Again, some of the things we get from nature. Let me give you an example. I hope I have the story correct. There's a commercial product called Laginex or Laginex, which is a fungal pathogen that's used for controlling mosquito larvae. It's not used very much yet, but I think it has enormous promise. I think it was discovered by accident on a Caribbean island by someone who was just interested in soil organisms, who was on vacation, who was just collecting samples opportunistically. And someone came up with this organism that's parasitic on mosquitoes and apparently not much else, that seems to have very important potential, both commercially and in terms of public health. I may be mixing a couple of stories together there, but it's the gist of it. Sylvia Haslam is a very well-known British author who has written a lot about wetlands and especially about Phragmites. She's had a long career studying Phragmites. This is a lovely book. It's 10 or 15 years old now, I think. We collectively have an unfortunate tendency to look at nature as being monolithic. You know, every tidal marsh is like every other one, or every black walnut tree, like out there next to the deck, is like every other one. And there's enormous variability that goes under the radar in that kind of discourse. These are some of the characteristics that vary within a stand. So a stand is, you know, loosely speaking, an area of Phragmites or reed bed that's bordered by something else. A marsh may have multiple stands of Phragmites, other kinds of variation at that scale, and then there are still other kinds of variation in the environment around the marsh and the environment around the stand within the marsh. Some of these are very important in shaping the architecture of the Phragmites and how other organisms use it. This is Iona Island Marsh, by the way, just south of Bear Mountain. It's a lovely, large, slightly brackish marsh that much of which now is dominated by Phragmites. There's some experimental herbicidal control going on, orchestrated by PIPC. This photograph was taken of a part of the marsh that week before the control had been initiated. One of the interesting things you can, well, I'm just going to let you look at this for a moment. What do you see in this? Forget the woods right now, but what do you see in the marsh that's really interesting?
It almost looks like a topographic map, like different elevations.
Yeah, that's not necessarily the substrate, that's the top of the Phragmites, but that's an important observation because it's taller and shorter. Tends to be shorter around the edges of the colonies or clones, but they're, you know, these are two different clones, and it looks like one is more vigorous than the other, or maybe has a phenological difference. It may develop faster and get taller sooner. Each of these clones or colonies, stands, I'll call them, and they've grown together, is probably a little bit different genetically and maybe also environmentally, because there's different topography and so on. This is a little tidal creek, for example, here. This is a little opening and larger opening back here with something other than Phragmites. So you can see in this glimpse of probably, I'm just guessing, probably 50 acres of tidal marsh, some of the variation in Phragmites that may be important to other plants or animals, it might be important to management, may be important to a lot of other things. The lodging is this in marsh plants, and I think the term is also used to some extent with terrestrial plants. It's breaking or bending, and so you can get this dense, often, not so much in this photograph, but often at this time of the year and during the winter, actually a platform that gets built half a meter or a meter above the ground in a dense stand of Phragmites, and that is used a lot by animals because it gets things up out of the water, but they're in the shelter of the reeds. I've spent some time looking at desert cottontail use of that. We don't think of cottontails as climbing, right? But they climb up on this meter-high platform in the southwest states, and in the spring they eat the young Phragmites shoots that are coming up, and I think they just hang out in there. And there's huge scat accumulations in some of these stands. So an admixture is the term that I use for a stand that, Phragmites stand that has other things growing in it. This happens to be swamp birch, I think, in northwestern Connecticut. There's another image later. Here's, this is ailanthus, but it could be a native tree forming a very sparse overstory above the Phragmites in the upper portion of a Connecticut river tidal marsh. These are vines. This is probably a Camp Smith in Putnam County, near Peekskill, climbing hempweed, and I think there's some other vines in there, and some things that are growing under the Phragmites. This is probably orange jewelweed, which is very...
So I have a question, this kind of goes on with this.
Sure. Yep.
So I deal with pasture plants all the time.
Okay.
So in there we see a lot of succession of plants, and so in here with the aspiration that occurs, do you find that it's putting out enough substrate that other plants can outcompete it at that point?
Yeah.
I'm trying to see what the
what's
succession is.
interesting, as far as I've found, no one has actually studied that quantitatively in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
What happens after Phragmites? Certainly some of these, some of the reed beds that you can see either in tidal or non-tidal marshes can be there for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're accreting sediment and doing other things, making the soil more organic in some cases, you would expect that to provide a good bed for other plants to grow. Or if it's just a case of, elderberry can do, common elderberry can do this, gray birch can do it where it's not too wet. There are and these are other trees back here, I don't know what. This is pretty common. So there are things that either preceded the Phragmites or that got started within the Phragmites that may eventually overtop it. We don't really know what happens.
What's the word when it puts, what is it? How do you say it? Accrete?
Yeah, that's.
Okay. I looked it up in your article, I never heard that word. Accretion.
Yeah,
Okay.
accretion.
Cool, thanks. Sounds like a good topic.
In Europe, in England, the UK particularly, there's been more research done on this question, and they often find that shrubs and trees like willows and other species gradually replace a Phragmites stand if it's not managed. And that actually is a weed problem in Phragmites that's grown for thatch. It ends up being what they call willow carr, which is, we have this stupid term scrub shrub. Two words that mean the same thing. I don't know who made that up. I don't use it, but in Europe it's called carr, C-A-R-R. You could just call it shrubland or shrub swamp. But it could be other things.
Do you see black walnut weed bed mixtures where the black walnut suppresses other plants?
Would have to be a mesic soil, you know, because black walnut isn't very flooding tolerant. And I haven't seen that I remember, but it wouldn't surprise me, because if you look, you can find almost anything growing with or around Phragmites. And there are things that don't do well, obviously, because in here, this is the edge, but if you go back in there, there's a lot of competition for light, nutrients, and space. And Phragmites is exceptionally good at competing. You know, Phragmites is a super weed, and that's one of the reasons it's so interesting, because we can learn a lot from plants that have co-evolved with us for probably thousands of years, both here and in Europe, if not longer, about what makes a weed, but also maybe ways that we can manage weeds better. So, you know, when I say I find animals and sometimes other plants in Phragmites reed beds, often someone will say, well, maybe that's because there isn't anything better nearby. And that certainly that's the case sometimes, but it's not the only factor that's involved. And all of these are very reasonable, and in some cases have been well documented, and in others they're more hypothetical. Pre-adaptation, if you're not familiar with this term, is an organism that evolved under conditions that may have, in this case, may have resembled Phragmites, so it has the ability to coexist with, whether it's chemically or physically or something else, with Phragmites, even though it didn't literally evolve with Phragmites. So, you know, peregrine falcons are cliff nesters originally. They evolved nesting on cliffs, and tall buildings and bridges are a lot like cliffs, and they make even better nest substrate for peregrines. You know, we're not going to go through all of this, but each of these habitat functions or types of use of Phragmites by other organisms has anywhere from a few to many species. There are lots of things that eat Phragmites, lots of insects, although most of them haven't been studied very well. Some of these, like mealy plum aphid on the leaves in the summer, this alternates with rose family woody plants, by the way, so it can be a pest on ornamentals or in apricot orchards in California, oddly enough. And the scale insect that I mentioned, which lives under the leaf sheath, reed scale, these are very common, and you can find them almost anywhere in the Hudson Valley. Some of these other things are less common. This is an outdated, but not inaccurate, but fewer numbers, smaller numbers than I would be able to show you now. Illustration of the numbers of bird species in the United States and Canada that have been documented using Phragmites or Phragmites reed beds in these various ways. And this isn't a function of that being the most common use, it's a function of what ornithologists study. You know, breeding birds sing and they're colorful, and so people like to study them. They're easier to study. It's much harder to study birds during migration, for example, this time of year. So there is a lot going on here. And some of these breeding species are represented by one or two published records. Some are species that, like the red-winged blackbird and the marsh wren to some extent, that use Phragmites quite often.
Are there any obligates?
No, not in North America, and probably not even in Europe. The closest thing to, you know, another argument or comment that you'll often hear is, well, there are lots of birds in Europe that have co-evolved with Phragmites and that depend on it and make intensive use of it. And that's more true than it is here, but none of them is really entirely tied to Phragmites. The best example is it's now called the bearded reedling. It's a little tiny bird that's probably distantly related to our chickadees that eats Phragmites seeds in the winter and eats insects in the reed bed during the breeding season. But they do forage outside of reed beds, and you know, but they're probably more dependent on it than almost any other bird in Europe. There are some other European birds that are very closely tied to reed beds. Some of the older warblers, like the great reed warbler, and there are some East Asian birds in China and probably other countries that are very closely tied to Phragmites. I don't know if there's anything that is 100% obligated. You know, those are tricky terms. I mean, terms like a pure stand or an obligate relationship, because you can almost always find exceptions. But we don't have anything like that. The birds here that are probably the icterine blackbirds, red-winged, common grackle, yellow-headed blackbird in the west, tricolored blackbird in California, the bow-tailed grackle from New Jersey south down the coastal plain. Those probably use Phragmites more than most other North American birds, but it's a very facultative relationship. So this is just more detail on some of the ways that other animals use Phragmites. This is interesting. I have seen this in a few places, including North Bay, just a couple of kilometers north of here. Ruby throats forage in the tassels around the edge of their reed bed, and they're probably harvesting small insects and spiders, because there's certainly no nectar there. But they eat a lot of small arthropods. So a colleague and I, back in 2000-2001, and this is in an unpublished report, which I could send you if you're really interested, spent 2 seasons studying 3 approximately 1 acre each Phragmites patches in North Bay, which is a 350 acre or 150 hectare freshwater tidal marsh, mostly dominated by cattail. And we compared the bird activity in the Phragmites patch with the activity in mostly cattail around the outside of the patch in an equal sized area. And this is a challenging thing to study, because it's very hard to see exactly where a bird is when you're out. Even the cattail is 3 meters tall at peak in the summer, and the Phragmites is 4 or more meters tall. but the differences were so dramatic that I think they greatly overwhelmed the fudge in the methodology that we were using. And I'll show you two examples. This is cattail, this is Phragmites. This is 2 hours before dusk. This is the last hour before dusk. And this huge influx, both in numbers and in species richness, numbers of species of songbirds, is a factor of birds going to roost in the Phragmites. And actually seeking, these birds come from probably cornfields at certain times of the year, or other habitats outside the marsh as well as within the marsh. And they fly into roost, and they seek out these small, relatively small patches of Phragmites in the midst of a sea of other vegetation. So this is habitat selection. And there seems to be, and this reed bed was sprayed. It was easier to photograph. Sprayed the year before by the DEC. But if you have a live reed bed, there apparently are two advantages to this phenomenon, which occurs all around the world, as far as I can tell, with many kinds of birds. One is a predator warning system because of a person or anything bigger than a kestrel maybe goes into the Phragmites. It makes a lot of sort of swishing and rattling, a lot of big commotion, and the birds just leave immediately. So they have an intrusion alarm. But the other thing is these live Phragmites or unsprayed stands, even in the winter, hold heat in the winter. And they also stay cool in the summer to some extent on hot days. So there's a thermal advantage to birds under certain conditions, including roosting on cool nights. Now this is the other example, and sorry this graph is oriented the other way, but this is Phragmites, this is cattail. These are breeding birds represented by singing during June. So it's really focused breeding activity. And this again is in North Bay, the same reed stands, and these are red-winged blackbirds, marsh wrens, and swamp sparrows, 3 species mostly. And very little of that kind of activity in the Phragmites, flocks, and cattail. So one of the lessons from this, there's a couple of interesting lessons from this that I take very seriously. One is you can't assess the importance of a patch of vegetation or something else in nature by just looking at one thing. So you might be concerned just about breeding birds, and that's fine. There are nature reserves where that's a management goal in a marsh or for a marsh, and that's a policy decision that's made. But the roosting is so important during migration and during the winter, and even during the breeding season with non-breeding individuals or birds that have finished breeding early in the season, that I can't help but think that it's very important to populations of certain bird species. Swallows also do a lot of roosting. Blackbirds, swallows, European starlings, and some other less common birds like eastern kingbirds. The other lesson is that these phenomena vary a lot from place to place. So we looked at how different reed beds and different marshes are different, and when I go down in the New Jersey Meadowlands and I look at Phragmites, I see different levels of use by different organisms, whether it's breeding marsh wrens or there's a lot of marsh wren breeding in Phragmites in the Meadowlands. There isn't in North Bay. They forage in it, but they don't usually nest in it. I don't know why that is. I don't think it's just the urban environment, because marsh wren breeding in Phragmites is well documented in other non-urban environments in the upper Midwest, for example. Why are there songbird relationships better developed in Europe than they are here? That is, more tightly evolved, apparently, or certainly ecologically tighter. Well, I don't know. These are some hypotheses, but one of the things that's probably the most important is that there's much more management of Phragmites in Europe than there is here. I mean, our management is trying to kill it, which doesn't make a better Phragmites habitat. It makes a habitat that's something other than Phragmites, if it works. So it's a different comparison. But a lot of European management is management of Phragmites for the sake of Phragmites, either for wildlife or for thatch or for something else. And in some places, at least, that has a big influence. Here's an example. This is from one of the fenland preserves in eastern England. This photograph, that is, where Phragmites is being harvested for thatch. Another thing that they do there, it's practiced a lot in the UK, is they take these big, dense Phragmites stands and they go in with heavy equipment and dig a large shallow pool. It could be 50 meters across, it could be larger or smaller than that, so pretty large pools. And that brings in a lot of organisms like waterfowl and shorebirds that don't use the dense Phragmites as much, although there are some waterfowl that nest and roost in Phragmites. And this is interesting. This figure's 30 or so years old, but this gives you an idea why, one of the reasons why they're concerned about the conservation of reed beds. And there are some birds in the UK that depend on reed beds, although that's not a Europe-wide phenomenon. The Chetty's warbler, the Savi's warbler, the Eurasian bittern, and the bearded reedling, I think are 4 of those species. There are some others. And most of these, well, not most of them, half of the reed beds are managed for thatch. And again, this is an old figure, but there's been a rejuvenation of the thatching industry, and thatching is a cultural phenomenon in England, so it's probably not too different now. Here are just some, opportunistic photographs. This is Veery, and that's down near the ground in the edge of a stand of Phragmites, and I think this was either elderberry or viburnum. This is the yellow warbler in a small patch of Phragmites mingled with herbaceous plants, large forbs. And this is interesting. This was in the Meadowlands in dry Phragmites on an abandoned garbage landfill, and there had been a wildfire just before I got there. This robin's nest was probably built on the lodged material layer that I mentioned earlier, because that can be very dense, and that's been documented in one other instance supporting robin nests. And when everything burned, the nest ended up right side up on the ground, and there was still a live nestling in it, but very exposed. Muskrats, very typical keystone marsh species. They do eat Phragmites. They eat it a lot in some situations and less in others. Depends on what else is available and probably other factors. This muskrat was in the Meadowlands in a big rain puddle on a pipeline road. It was also eating mugwort, which I thought was unusual. Beaver Lodge in Kingsland, North Bay, in the edge of a dense reed bed on the bank of a tidal creek, and a beaver dam in Connecticut, abandoned beaver dam actually with Phragmites growing out of it. So that's one of the ways that Phragmites gets into non-tidal wetlands, or does well in non-tidal wetlands. It likes the dams, the abandoned dams, and it likes the drawn down beaver ponds where there's some wet, usually mineral sediment, and probably can seed into some of those situations.
Whoa.
This is the only time this has been documented in Sussex County, New Jersey. I don't know whether it occurs in other places or not. Bears often do this in shrub thickets in the Northeast, and from the bear's point of view, this might just have been another shrub thicket. But lots of good insulation here in this nest that the bear has made for itself. This is Henry's marsh moth, which I mentioned, that feeds on Phragmites, but also lots of other grass species. This is the mealy plum aphid on the leaves in the summer. Some years these are very, very abundant, others they're not. A patch mine in a leaf with a fly larva in it. This is the reed scale with the leaf sheath removed. This is a fully adult appendage-less scale insect with a waxy coating around it. It's about 4 millimeters long. Give you a scale. And here's a meadow grasshopper, which I also found feeding on Phragmites. This is not Phragmites, obviously, that the adult broadwing skipper is nectaring at, but this is the range of the broadwing skipper. This is the range of the Yuba skipper. They're both native butterflies. They're both butterflies that have larvae that develop on Phragmites. The Yuba skipper only on native Phragmites, as far as is known. The broadwing skipper on non-native and sometimes native Phragmites in the east, and also on wild rice and lakeside sedge. And those might be different species, nobody really knows. Different species of the skipper, or they might all be the same. It's very common to have host races in butterflies. Bryophytes in the upper edge of a tidal marsh, growing with sparse Phragmites. You can also see this under dense Phragmites sometimes. This is not a study plot. This is just a happenstance formation of dead Phragmites stalks. And here are a couple of rare tidal marsh plants that sometimes grow with Phragmites. Mudwort and Long's bittercress. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly, but other parts of the country, mostly where birds, mostly breeding birds, have been studied in relation to Phragmites, and they're examples of more use of Phragmites or less use of Phragmites compared to an alternate plant community or alternate breeding bird habitat. This is a fish example. These numbers are different papers. This is a little out of date now. There's now been I think I'll show it in another slide. There's a nice review paper and meta-analysis of all of these and more studies. But the gist of this is Phragmites compared to cattail in freshwater, and Phragmites compared to Spartina in brackish water. And in most of the studies, the fish assemblage was similar between the two habitats. There are instances, mostly involving the early life stages of the mummichog, which is a very abundant, typical tidal marsh fish in fresh or brackish water, not being as abundant in flooded Phragmites as in flooded Spartina or Typha cattail. And there are some other fishes that don't do as well, especially when they're young in Phragmites. But in most cases, there really isn't that much difference. And the more recent paper by Dibble, I can't think of her first name. She was a graduate student at the University of Rhode Island. analyzes these relationships in more detail. And Phragmites can be a problem for fish assemblages in some cases, but not universally. This is the Dibble and Myerson paper. So it's a quotation. I didn't want to read this. It's a quotation from the conclusions paper. And, you know, from my point of view, there are a couple of things that are really interesting about this. One is that, in general, if you spread your analysis across the Middle Atlantic and up through New England, and lots of different kinds of environments and alternate plant communities, although it's mostly spartina. Yes, there's a negative effect on the fish assemblage. But we don't manage meta-analyses. Meta-analysis, by the way, it's used in the health sciences a lot, and in ecology. It's a technique for taking lots of different studies that have found patterns and putting them all together to yield a larger scale result. But we don't manage meta-analyses. We manage individual species and individual habitats mostly, and sometimes groups of species, because we can't deal with everything individually. So one of the lessons that I take from this is that if you're interested in fish, you might very well manage differently in different geographic locations on the East Coast, or in different kinds of habitats, fresh versus brackish, and so on. And you might manage differently for, this is about benthic invertebrates versus nekton is swimming organisms, vigorously swimming organisms, so it's fishes and also a few invertebrates like the blue crab are considered nekton because they're strong swimmers. So you might manage differently for nekton than you do for benthos, or birds, or vines, or something else. So again, this is the issue of variability of so many different kinds from one patch or marsh to another, or one place to another. And here are some invertebrate studies. Some of them have definitely found an adverse effect of Phragmites. Some, like the Yuha study in the New Jersey Meadowlands, found not much difference between Phragmites and smooth cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora. There's some methodological problems with this study that I don't want to get into, but it did find a negative effect of Phragmites. And this one did as well. And this was a PhD research project that was done very carefully, to my knowledge. Okay, so you probably gleaned all of this from what I've said already, but these are some of the generalizations about habitat functions of Phragmites. And I'm talking about the North American, mostly about the northeastern states, because that's where the bulk of the information comes from. There's a lot, I'm not going to go into this in detail. There's a lot of problems. It's a difficult thing to study. A lot of studies have been very limited in scope, in time or space, and there are other problems that some of which are not avoidable, some are avoidable and weren't avoided. There's some other kinds of problems. So one of the things you have to be careful of, and this is not just about Phragmites or even about invasive plants in general, is that much of what we know is based on studies that were very limited in space and time, a year or two in one place, or, you know, in a good piece of PhD research, maybe a maybe 3 or 4 years in several different places. But given the variability, you might only be seeing a small window of processes and ecosystem services. And so we tend to generalize, like with Phragmites allelopathy in the laboratory, which was pretty dramatic in that one experiment on the seedlings of other plants, mostly not marsh plants, but we did test some marsh plants. We tend to generalize or jump to conclusions about things like that. And the world of invasive species research and management is so complicated and so emotional and often acrimonious that that kind of questionable extrapolation is very, very common. But it is in a lot of other things. I mean, if you read the health food literature, you'll see the famous example from my youth is Adele Davis's books, like how to eat fit, how to eat right to be fit, or something like that, and a bunch of other popular books. But she would take one study that said, and I'm making this up because I haven't looked at the books in a long time. You can see this in a lot of other literature, including scholarly studies sometimes. In one study that might say, if you take 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C a day, you won't get colds. That actually came from a scientist, Linus Pauling, but he's experimenting on himself. So it wasn't a scientific study. And we, to this day, don't really know whether that's true or not. But a lot of people, including me, although I think there are other reasons to take vitamin C supplements, and you might very well not agree with me about that. We still don't know whether it wards off colds or not. Okay, so you've seen that. So here, if we look at this from the point of view of ecosystem services, which, you are applied ecologists and managers, as far as I understand. And so it's what people get out of Phragmites or something else that probably a lot of your questions revolve around. So these are, in very brief summary, some of the things that we get from Phragmites, that it mostly does very well. Actually does all these things very well, although in the United States these haven't been documented and studied as well as these have. I think there's more here. Well, here's some examples. This is in the Meadowlands. This was just a few years ago, but they are now no longer allowed into this particular property because it's a nature reserve, and they're probably harvesting Phragmites somewhere else for Sukoff. And they would go in every year, and they were harvesting about, you can't see it all in this picture, but probably close to a hectare, a couple of acres of Phragmites. And that Phragmites, when it came back up, this is in the end of the summer, I think. Certainly looks like it.
Number that probably.
Yeah.
Time
So if you look at this Phragmites and just around the edge here during the growing season, there's a lot more diversity in there, even though it's only been cut once a year for 15 or 20 years. If you really want to diversify Phragmites, you have to cut it more often. But I went into, somewhere over here, within a few meters of the edge, under the Phragmites, and I found 26 other species of plants. That was just one sample, so I don't know how representative it is. These are, I'm just trying to level the playing field here, really. I don't want you to take away from this seminar that I think there should be more Phragmites, or that I'm a defender of Phragmites, or that I think these studies that have documented negative effects are not important. I think it's a very site-specific and goal-specific issue. You know, there's a very popular word in politics now, situational, because Trump is supposed to, instead of developing careful, long-standing policies, he makes very ad hoc decisions, a lot of people think. So, you know, nature management is very situational in a good way, because, but you also need larger scale policy, because each place you're managing has different conditions, the different other species, and different management goals in many cases. So anyway, these are things that a lot of people say they don't like about invasive plants, like Phragmites or multiflora rose or knotweed or hydrilla, or you know, any number of other Eurasian water milfoil. But those are not properties that are limited to non-native invasive plants. They can all be found in native plants and native vegetation processes, if you look. They may be more common, there may be stronger tendencies with some weeds like Phragmites. Yes?
Sort of along those lines, I'm always wondering with some of the major invasives, you know, like knotweed and Phragmites and things, you know, to what degree they are just outstanding competitors, or even, you know, looking at it sort of, I think, now the old-fashioned way in terms of being an aggressive plant. You know, how much of it is that, and how much of it is that the habitat has been severely disturbed in some way, probably chemical, that is not totally obvious to us by looking at it, and then something like the Phragmites is just one of the few things that can then, you know, they can then live or, you know, compete in that environment. Like you had asked about the what is the succession like? You know, what happens after Phragmites, and I kind of wonder if whatever the disturbance is that created a good scenario for the Phragmites, if that's not addressed, can you ever have a succession to something else?
Well, those are very important points, and there are two terms, invasiveness and invasibility, that are used mostly by researchers. This is a property of the plant, of the weed, or of an invasive insect, or whatever. This is a property of the environment that it's colonizing or invading. And in the case of Phragmites, both of these things are important. So invasibility is often overlooked or not considered important enough or importantly, and that's the pervasive salinization, eutrophication, hydrological alteration, physical disturbance of soils and vegetation, and so on, that our activities have created for hundreds of years, and at least locally, thousands of years in North America.
And also it could be other things in terms of like the decreasing in prevalence of, you know, herbivores. One thing I always think of here, you know, like you mentioned in your paper, Megalonyx, the giant ground sloth was a grazer of these reed beds, and they probably did a lot of, you know, damage to a reed bed.
Also American buffalo, 2-meter-long giant Pleistocene beavers. Nobody knows what they did to the environment. You can only imagine. But there are lots of processes and effects that we have and that other things like beavers have that alter invasiveness. That alter invasibility, which is the vulnerability of the environment or the habitat to being invaded. But Phragmites also is a superweed, and it's very invasive, so it has invasiveness at a very high level. I don't care for the, I'm not criticizing you, Laura, but I don't care for the term aggressive because it's very anthropomorphic, and there's a lot of anthropomorphizing in invasion ecology. But it's a very competitive plant in an ecological sense, which is what aggressive means usually.
So do you see it as, I guess, frequently as you would expect in places where there has been, I mean, and if you don't necessarily see disturbance, you don't see the salinity differences and things, but in areas that are sort of relatively undisturbed by people?
Yes. So I studied for several years a small, essentially a headwater stream, oligotrophic. We actually measured phosphorus and so forth, and very low nutrient levels. Bordered by extensive wet meadows and marshes in Salisbury, Connecticut, the upper end of Moore Brook. And there was a lot of sedge meadow, there was a lot of Phragmites, there was a lot of other stuff in there, and there was a lot of beaver activity. And probably, I don't know how the Phragmites got started or what really gave it an edge in there. It wasn't nutrients because the phosphorus and probably the nitrogen levels were very low. And it wasn't direct human activities because there was no dam or there was a little footbridge. That was the extent of human activities. And it was mostly surrounded by forest. It could have been beaver, abandoned beaver dams and abandoned drawn down beaver ponds because the beavers kept moving around from one spot to another, and I could see when beaver flooded an area and the Phragmites was under flooding stress, it got shorter or sparser, and when the beavers left that particular spot and the water drew down, the Phragmites got more vigorous. So that might have been a major factor, but it didn't seem to be direct human influence either when I was there or in the relatively recent past. I don't know what happened there 100 years. It was probably all farmed, and there could have been some influence of cattle or something else. But a lot of the non-native Phragmites that we see in this part of the world is in roadside ditches, which are salty from de-icing compounds. It can tolerate quite well up to about half seawater salinity, so up to about 15 or 20 parts per thousand salinity. That's a lot of salt. We see it in places like the Hudson River marshes, which have been disturbed by the railroads and by, it doesn't look like it now, but 150 years ago, there was no forest, a real little forest here, except it was a Montgomery place where the owners preserved the forest for some peculiar reason. But everything else was raised by cattle or developed for human activities, estate activities. You see it in the meadowlands in New York City where you have salinization in the meadowlands. The dam that was built at Oradell to impound water for water supply in the Oradell Reservoir caused much greater salinity intrusion up the Hackensack River than had been the case before about 1920. And so salinization, all the mosquito ditching, all the even earlier attempts at agriculture, which involved diking and drainage and pumping water out and doing all kinds of other things. And dikes, by the way, are perfect places for Phragmites to get established and then spread into the marsh because like a lot of plants, strawberry, for example, it has clonal integration, which means that one part of the clone that's connected by rhizomes, in the case of Phragmites, can share with another part of the clone water, nutrients, and photosynthate. So if it gets started on the edge of the dike where conditions are ideal, that part of the colony can then feed the part of the colony that's spreading out into the marsh until it gets really well established. And that was actually very well studied experimentally in the field by David Bart, who was a Rutgers PhD student. We see this in New York City and marshes that have been altered in all kinds of different ways. We see it around, I don't know how many of you deal with farm ponds or ornamental ponds. That's a question that often arises from cooperative extension and other quarters. You'll often see Phragmites get established around the edge of a farm pond, and sometimes people get upset because they can't see the water any longer. On the other hand, some people really like it because it often brings birds. But a group of small ponds, even as little as 1/4 of an acre each, with 1 to 2 meter wide Phragmites borders. And I'm thinking of an example on Staten Island in Mariners Marsh, which is a city park, is very, very good bird habitat for all kinds of breeding and non-breeding marsh and water birds and songbirds. Not always, but often, and certainly at Mariners Marsh. So we've done a lot of things that increase invasibility or cause invasibility, but it's not the only factor. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on out there that we really don't understand yet, because even though Phragmites is probably the best studied wild plant worldwide now, thousands and thousands of scientific papers have been published and continue to be published. There are many things that we don't know about it. So, I do have another, we're out of time, I don't know whether you want to stick around. I have another set of slides, which is more management oriented, but I want to emphasize that every invasive weed is different. And some of the things that I'm saying about Phragmites can be generalized to other species to some extent. And many of them can't be. And you have to keep in mind a couple of very important principles about invasive species management. And probably the one that's most important, which I perhaps should have mentioned at the beginning, is that the most important thing to do is to keep non-native species out. And we're very, very bad at doing that, as you can see from all the pests and pathogens that are killing forest trees, most recently the ashes. So that's the first thing. And I'm not saying this to be xenophobic or anti-horticulture or anything like that. It's just true. You can't get away from that as being stopping the introduction of new species unless we're absolutely sure they're not going to be harmful in 100 years. And we don't know in most cases. I mean, we can look back and say, common lilac is not invasive because people were planting it 150 years ago and it just stays put. It might spread a meter or two.
But knotweed didn't spread for 40, 50 years.
Yeah, there you go. A lot of invasive species just sit unnoticed for many years. It could be 20 years, it could be 100 years or more. There's a lag period. So I don't know what to call that, but let's call that
Dispersal, right?
Sorry?
He said prevention, I said
yeah.
dispersal.
Yeah, prevention is the
Dispersal
word I was
prevention.
looking for. Yeah. So, it would be great if we had the money in the federal agencies to keep seeds and other propagules from getting into the United States, either accidentally or intentionally.
But it's so hard to do. I mean, like with the lanternfly that's now, has a couple sightings in New York, probably came from Pennsylvania. There was a I don't want to say million, but many thousands of dollars poured into trying to stop that from coming up. I mean, they stopped trucks that were bringing up slate and other rock which they lay ag masses on. They stopped those, inspected them, but you know, it's a matter of time for a lot of these things.
So that's important, but it's a little bit different because once an insect gets here, you can't get rid of it, except in very rare instances. Look at the medfly. Look how much, not here in the Hudson Valley that I know of, but look how much money was poured into controlling or trying to eradicate medfly, first in Southern California and then in a few other warmer climate parts of the United States, and it's still here. And we, you know, so so quarantines, the good thing about quarantines is that they slow something down, and there's time to develop other ways of managing, like biocontrol, for example. And that's hopefully what's happening with emerald ash borer and a lot of it, including some plants. So the second thing is what we call EDRR, early detection, rapid response. So this is, and this can be on the scale of the whole country, or it can be on the scale of an individual nature reserve, like Arlington High School, where we spent 20 years building and studying a wetland mitigation project for Blanding's turtles. We didn't want Phragmites there because there wasn't any there when we started, and we were pretty sure it would be adverse to Blanding's turtles, so it might not be to something else, like spotted turtles, which I heard someone mention earlier. So this is, try to find these things when they're just getting started, when it's only a couple of square meters instead of acres or hectares or square kilometers. And then you can eradicate it, hopefully, with relatively little cost and relatively few side effects, ecological side effects. But the problem is finding things and getting people to care about things that are rare. You know, how many, mile a minute is probably the best example in the Hudson Valley. You know, we knew it was a problem for Delaware and New Jersey and so forth. And a lot of effort was put into finding places where it was just getting started. And I think it hasn't been eradicated in the Hudson Valley, but I think it was slowed down enough so that the classical biocontrol program, which is now permitted in New York State, can be used and have enough of an effect to really accomplish something. And by the way, I have very mixed concerns about classical biocontrol, which I think is really not a good idea for Phragmites, because there's some research and a couple of papers that I'm a co-author on that are predicting, on the basis of a good amount of evidence, that insects that are introduced to control non-native Phragmites will almost certainly sooner or later do more damage to native Phragmites, because almost all of the other insects that have been accidentally introduced with non-native Phragmites are now doing more damage to native Phragmites. And there's a number of other reasons, like what are you going to do with sludge drying facilities? There's thousands of them. And those are worth a lot of money in the United States. So that's an interesting controversy. But anyway, EDRR is very important. The next, this is not necessarily linear from here on, but stands can be contained. You don't necessarily have to try to eradicate them to accomplish a goal that is rational and makes nature management sense. And you know, and that can be containment, or let's put containment here for the hell of it. And then there's another principle, which is modification, modifying stands to make better habitat for something or to produce more of an ecosystem surface. And that could be, you know, water quality, songbird habitat, or something else. there's very little precedent for this in the United States, but there's a lot in Europe and a little bit in southern Canada and a little bit in the U.S. And one of the interesting examples that I think really encompasses all of these is very small scale, very targeted, low intensity prescribed grazing with cattle, sheep, or goats for managing or even eliminating small Phragmites reed beds. And this can be up to an acre or more. I mean, not necessarily just the size of this table. In bog turtle habitats. Also and this has been tried on a larger scale, I can't remember where, in the Chesapeake Bay region with goats. It apparently has some potential on a larger scale, although most of the work that's been done in the U.S. has been done on a very small scale. Most of it's been done by Jason Tesoro, who's a bog turtle researcher and bog turtle habitat manager. We worked on an experimental project for 5 years with Jason, just about to be published. Less with Phragmites than with other taller growing plants that are problematic in bog turtle habitat. But one of the things we noticed is that the very low intensity cattle use when we allowed them to, they went right for a little stand of Phragmites, and I showed you a photograph of the damage to the leaves. And if we targeted the Phragmites stand, we could have eliminated it in a few years. Now there are obviously other options here. I mean, you can leave something alone, and and there may be situations where that makes sense with Phragmites or with certain other invasive plants. So this is, we could call this no action, or maybe a version of that, which I like here, which is monitoring. Let's monitor how much there is and some of the effects of the Phragmites, and like in IPM, have a threshold established a priori that says if there gets to be this much of Phragmites, or if it starts to do more than X of something, then we're going to manage it. And there are other, this isn't all encompassing. You probably have questions. I mean, how many of you actually deal with management of Phragmites? Okay. You've thought about it, though. Yeah. How many of you deal with management of other invasive plants? Okay. Well, half or most of you. What species?
I gotta manage my way out of here because I have a 1 o'clock appointment.
Okay.
Well, mostly pasture species, so knapweed. I'm seeing things that are drier than you normally grow in something like Phragmites will grow. But I do want to think more about grazing it with cattle. I think you could hit it really hard once or twice a season.
Yeah.
Because something like that, if I had that in a field, I would trample it. I would run the cattle back and forth over it, knock it down, and the stuff will go up through it.
You can't do that in a bog turtle habitat, but you can do it in some other places.
Yeah, and that's why I wouldn't use cattle either, because I think maybe they're too much hugging in the ground. It's so interesting to hear about it. Thanks so much. This is great.
Yeah, email me about the knapweed management.
Oh, God. All right. Well, you have a card here?
Yeah, let me.
Thank you. I'll see you guys all later. It's nice to see you.
Some of you,
At 1 o'clock.
No, thank you. This is spelling a lot of hits I had on right.
Good.
Be nicer too.
So this is an illustration. This is a case study. It can't be